So why aren't comic books considered more important, more critical to entertainment? I mean, game companies, when they launch a game, it's a major event. There's game award ceremonies, there's marketing, millions and millions of dollars of marketing. Now, granted, the spend for games is a lot more, but why are comic books kind of this hidden thing on the side? Shouldn't they be more important? I mean, they're the genesis behind billion-dollar films. They've got a history of of decades and decades of comics, plenty of IP being created. Why aren't comics more critical? Let's talk about that. One of the most frustrating things about comics for me is that they represent a pretty critical part of our pop culture. They're just as important as TV shows, as movies, as games. And yet, pretty much all of those other forms of media have evolved much faster, much bigger, and with much more prominence and importance than comic books. If you grew up in the 70s, in the 80s, you probably remember thinking about comic books in much the same way that you thought about TV and about movies. And definitely movies are a bigger deal in the sense of Star Wars is a big event, but it was not uncommon if you were a kid to think about, do I want to read some comics? Do I want to try and find something on TV? Do I want to play a game? Do I want to watch a movie? And those were all kind of at the same level in terms of entertainment. The idea that these comics and these things were important were, I mean, they were. You waited to get the next adventure. And if you think about it, there were a lot of handicaps against comics at the time. They were easy to find, sure, on the newsstand, but it's not like you had the internet. It's not like you had people writing blogs tracking the latest developments. It's not like if you forgot about something, you just look up Wikipedia and find it. If you were trying to figure out some missing information or parts about a run, I mean, your option was really to go down to your local Walden Books or B. Dalton's, find the Overstreet price guide there, and try and look it up yourself. And so it created this almost discovery mechanism and mentality for comics that has always existed. Yet, despite all that, as the decades went by, as we got through the 80s and through the 90s and the aughts, and we saw a lot of developments. We saw that we were getting, movies were going from VHS to DVD to Blu-ray to digital. We saw music was having a similar transition. We had movies having more and more kind of elaborate aspects to them. We saw the internet kind of come up and provide a really powerful companion to all of these things to get more interest from people into these hobbies. We saw, we saw a rise of pop culture elements. If you were a kid in the early 80s, if you were too into, TV, movies or comics or these kind of things, you're a nerd. And it's like you should be into sports. You should be into, as a boy anyway, you should be into blowing crap up with a gun, whatever you happen to be into. And so these things were kind of underground hobbies. But games, I mean, video games, movies, shows, they rose out of that to become pretty critical parts of pop culture. The idea that today, streaming services and Netflix is an essential part of life. I was watching somebody on TV talk about how, Netflix should be free to people during the pandemic because it was an essential service. And I mean, that's a laughable statement, but it just goes to show you that people are find these forms of entertainment critical. And yet, comic books are, if anything, kind of stayed completely silent from all that. You do not see the same people saying comic books are critical. You do not see people, pointing out that comic books are getting more and more and more important. They remain kind of this offshoot thing. Some of that's by design. Some of the comic creators, some of the people who are, running these companies, like the fact that comics, runs underground. They see it almost as a romantic. This has to be cheap, that we don't make a lot of money, but we're punk rock. I see creators every now and then saying that, like, we're punk rock, and I think there's a big difference between saying I like punk rock and I want this industry to stay loose and stay free to make whatever stories I want. That's all cool, but what's a little less cool is when you say I want to be poor. I mean, and I think some of the people who say I want it to be punk rock, they don't understand what punk rock means. Instead, they mean they want to, it's like I was watching a panel. God, I think this was 2018, 17 or 18. So it was a couple of years ago, and a writer um, was talking about. I mean, Rick Remender was talking about kind of the romance of just doing it on your own, being poor. And it wasn't what he exactly meant, but the comment stuck with me in the sense of why are people so in comics so willing to kind of jump onto that behavior? If you look by contrast, you look at people in the game industry who's like, I'm buying a Bentley. And you see people in movies and music like, I'm gonna, buying $1 million houses, and just they are trying to evolve to be celebrities, rich celebrities. And there's a grossness behind that. So don't get me wrong, please, in what I'm saying. Don't get me wrong that greed is good and we should all be after kind of a baller lifestyle. I mean, there's a shallowness to that as well. But I almost feel like comics overcompensates for that. That they're so nervous about being accused of being ballers, of being rich people, that they almost want to throw money away. They want to they almost want to ignore kind of this stuff, or actively work against it, which is really peculiar. I mean, if you think about it, it's really odd that this is where things have come. I think that for comics to be healthy, there has to be this belief that that we do want to get rich. I think, and what's interesting here is that there's a guy I've interviewed on the show before, Larry King, and he does what I would call underground comics, and I label it that. It's my own label. It's not his, but I view it because he picks himself up. He produces. If he doesn't have an active market, he just makes it anyway, and he just gets it done, and he puts it out, and it's got a kind of an indie feel to it. True indie, not like a lot of indie comics look like Marvel comics are just labeling themselves indie. This actually has that kind of not grunge, but it has that feeling of it, that it's like, here is somebody who's this is his. You could tell it's his vision, it's his idea, and it's on the page. It's not him pretending to be somebody else's vision on the page. It's his. And to me, that is punk rock. That is underground. That is truly kind of going for it. But at the same time, you talk to Larry, you listen to that interview. I mean, Larry would love to sell 50,000 copies of his comic book. It's not like he's like, hey, I'm doing it this way, and I don't ever want to be sold in stores. I remember, again, same panel. This wasn't Remender, but it was somebody else in the panel. So I was hesitating for a minute. I'm trying to remember who the other person on there was. Made a comment about kind of the newsstand and how they don't want to see comics. That there's a cool, they don't want to see comics in like Safeway or the grocery stores. There's something cool about having those comics, in specialty shops, in real comic shops. In I think that was a quote, real comic shops, as opposed to everywhere. And so it's weird to me that this industry kind of steers away from success. It actively kind of wants to shun this idea that they want to go big. And then at the same time, people complain about, we don't have insurance, we don't have the lifestyle, we don't have the cars we want, and some people are very bitter about the fact that these movies, comic book movies, are making billions of dollars, and comic books are this invisible thing. And you kind of look at it and say, well, some of you have kind of pushed to keep it this way. I kind of wonder if you could go back in time right now to the 80s, and you could put comics on the same kind of entertainment track as movies and games and shows and other things. I mean, I think there was some natural progression to build up this industry that would have kept it as a big pop culture item. Because someone said, well, the problem was people are never going to want to carry around paper. It's the fact that it's a paper floppy, thing that's going on. Except, books have certainly had their moments. I mean, watching people wait in line to get Harry Potter. This doesn't happen every week, of course, but it's not like books are kind of this shunned underground thing. It's managed to stay, pretty much as a core part of our history. But comic books have not. It's very, very weird, and I think it's unhealthy. I think there's been an abnormal attempt to keep comics from being successful. And maybe it's philosophical in nature, who knows, or maybe it's just because some of the people who are running the comics are kind of, they don't really know what they're doing. And I say that in a, I'm not trying meaning that in a really rude, obnoxious way. I mean it in a, although I know it sounds that way, and I'm sorry about that, but I mean it in a, you know, there's a lot of tech startups where the people who start up the company have a good idea in their head. They have a good market sales idea. They're able maybe to get some angel funding of a couple $1 million to get things going. But what they don't have is they don't have the knowledge to go get true, venture funding, true venture capital to really put into their business. So maybe they have a really hot idea, but they're only able to raise $1-2 million to do it, as opposed to going out and raising, say, 40-50 million dollars for the same idea. Whereas somebody who has some savviness in business, who understands venture capital, knows how to do that. And I think that's a, I mean, there's a decent analogy here to kind of vet out around. That's the problem with comics, is there's not enough people who are at the top who are really trying to run this like a powerful, let's make a lot of money business. I also think there's one other factor I'll throw in here, which is maybe a more sinister one, and that's that comic companies, the people in charge of it, and maybe this dates all the way back to Stan Lee and some of the shenanigans he pulled with Jack Kirby and other things. There's this behavior that we can't give the creators too much. We can't share the pot too much. We don't want to make it too lucrative for them. You saw the Image guys kind of bail out and do their own thing. I mean, part of that was Marvel could have ponied up and said, okay, let's use this as a moment to change the entire business model, keep these guys, and pay them a lot more, and start paying people who are successful a lot more, and actually make some millionaires out of the mix. You could have seen that moment, but instead there was almost a, hey, now we don't want to pay people too much. We don't want to give people too much credit. You see some of the fights around royalties and just reprints and names getting put on covers and other things, and you see some of those arguments, and you realize that there's almost a push to kind of deprioritize a lot of that stuff. And if you're working to deprioritize people getting recognition or people getting paid in these instances, then it stands to reason that you're going to lower the overall money in the industry completely as a result. I mean, if you're Marvel, you're certainly making money, but I'm not sure that a lot of the guys at Marvel and DC and these places necessarily know what to do with it. Like when they go to a con and they're able to put out a big display, do they understand the value of the marketing of what they're trying to do? They understand the importance, because a lot of these big cons have just kind of submitted to movies and other pieces of pop culture just kind of taking over. It's, you go to San Diego Comic Con and it's like the comic companies rolled over and said, hey, let's just make this about movies and about TV and other things. Why did they do that? Why did they willingly kind of put themselves as secondary to these other mediums? I don't. It's not normal. It's not natural what has happened. And when you talk to some of the people in charge, some of the leaders, or you listen to them, they're folksy guys. They're kind of like, we're making some money and everything else. But are they making big money? Like, I'll put it to you this way: in games or TV or movies, as producer credit and other things, if you had properties that were being kind of spun as some of the most recognizable in the world, and if you talk about entertainment properties like top 20, there are several comic properties that are on that list. Superman, Batman, probably Wonder Woman, definitely the Avengers at this point. They are on that list as Spider-Man as really recognizable figures. If you're in charge of a company that owns those properties that are getting licensed out and used multiple places, then your salary should probably be, in excess. I mean, you should be coming close to 9 figures. You should be in the mid to upper 8 figures. And I said this once to some folks in comics, some editors in comics at Comics Pro, and they just laughed me out of the room. Like, that's absolutely absurd what you're saying. Except the same position in gaming or in TV with far less recognizable characters, that is what they're making. That is what they are pulling in. They're pulling in that kind of cash. It is, I mean, the gap between what Feige makes and, hey, if you work at Marvel, you can go check that out. There's some public record of what Feige makes, both in terms of base salary and incentives and bonuses and stock and all those other things. I mean, that guy is in 8-figure territory, climbing north fast. I mean, and that's not unreasonable for him to be there. The thing that's unreasonable is, why aren't more of you there? That's how you should be thinking. And I mean, it's what every now and then keeps me up at night, where I sometimes think to myself, it's time for me to, kind of sell off my assets. And if I didn't have kids, I wasn't married, I would absolutely be moving to some of these places and gathering some people together and saying, let's go get really rich. Let's go raise some money and get really, really rich, because this model that we're doing now is artificially suppressed. That's what I'm saying. Anyway, this has gone on for a bit longer, but I want people to kind of imagine, and if there's somebody from the comic industry, whether you're a creator or somebody else, I mean, granted, some of the things I've said are pie in the sky dreams, but they're not impossible ones. And please do yourself a favor, start looking up, by comparison, other fields, other industries, and see what kind of money and incentives and other things are being pulled there. That is where you should be. That is how it should go. And I mean, come on, let's go. Let's really go make some money. That's I think that's healthy. It's not greed is good. It's not capitalism rules at all. It is, you know, you guys are creating some of the most recognizable, powerful assets in the world. We should take this seriously, both in terms of the content and in terms of the rewards. It should be taken very seriously. It should not be this kind of underground hidden thing, no matter how romantic that might sound. It's, you only go around this world once. We somehow find these people who are living for, I mean, there's people living in LA and New York making less than 100,000, less than 75,000 a year, managing giant global properties. By contrast, a buddy of mine leaves college, is not that smart. I mean, nice guy, goes to work at Amazon, $160,000 base right out of college, plus benefits, plus incentives, plus bonuses, plus all those things. I mean, the total comp value for that guy is probably around 250. He is 21, and and who knows what the hell he's making? I mean, he's making like a drop shadow on a button somewhere for the housewares web. I mean, if that. I think he's part of a team that's investigating Kubernetes. I mean, cool. Don't you think? Like, more of you should be making that. I think you should. Just saying. Anyway, what do you think? Just start dreaming. Leave a comment below. Like, subscribe, introduce to a friend in comics, and make them rich. Why don't we do that? Follow me on Twitter, Facebook at Comic Perch. Thanks for listening.